The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. I know last time we kind of talked through a lot of these turn and river concepts, and I wanted to kind of primarily prioritize going into some more river stuff today, but did anything come up since last time that you also want to kind of add to the agenda or talk about?
I think just continuing where we left off is a good start right now.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good. So what I want to do is actually talk through some river concepts by focusing a little bit more on a node that I think is kind of I don't know if it's an understudied node necessarily, but I think it's a really good part of the tree for understanding how river spots actually work. And that's not going to be the situation where we just like barrel off and we're trying to decide which hands to bluff on river, because we kind of covered a little bit of that last time. And a lot of it is going to come down to, in certain circumstances, we're just going to, there's only going to be certain hands that we have available to bluff with. So we're just going to kind of have to bluff with them. Instead, what I want to talk about is the node where one street is check through. So primarily the turn being checked through, I think, is a really good node to talk about. So let's kind of look at that. And what you'll probably see from looking at a few sims in that area is that eventually we reach like a lot of pretty complex river strategies, and it becomes pretty important to just kind of have an understanding of how those strategies are built and why some of them look the way they do, because otherwise it can just end up being like pretty tricky to to really kind of figure out what's going on. So let me share my screen with the Octopi interface. And I'm going to look at 60 bigs again, just like a pretty standard sort of stack size to look at. And I'm going to pick a board texture where it's a pretty standard sort of a range bet for low jack here. We're going to go king 7-3. And I would assume that, I would assume that low jack is just going to range bet here. Let me see if it's actually doing that. Okay, so there's a small amount of really big betting here. I guess I want to look at one where there's not as much big betting. So let's try king 8-3. Oops. King 8. Damn it. There we go. King 8-3. Might be a little better because the king 7-3 is obviously there's a gut shot in there. So there's a little bit of a change to how the range interactions are going to work. Hopefully this is just range bet small. It's close enough. Range bet small, basically, pretty accurate there, or pretty reasonable approach to go with. So we're going to focus on that. And I think the thing that I want to hone in on is when it goes range bet and then check call, and then it goes check check on turn. So let's say we put like a 7 up there on turn, just a pretty sort of nondescript turn. And then we look at what happens when it goes check check and how the river is going to play out. So I think before we look at that, let's say we just think about this specific kind of a betting line when it you check call the flop, let's say, and you're the out of position player, you're the big blind, and turn goes check check, and we're trying to figure out how to play the river. How do you feel like you're thinking about those spots in game? Like, what sort of things do you find yourself thinking about to try to figure out a river strategy?
As the big blind, talking
Yeah,
about?
as a big blind to begin with, and then we'll talk about as the in position player in a minute.
Um, with a turn like this, I'm kind of like thinking what kind of value hands are actually going to be check check on the turn here from his
Okay.
C bet on the flop, and deciding if the hand, whatever specific hand that I have, if it's actually beating any of his value or if it's not, and
Okay.
kind of going from there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the starting point has to really be to figure out what's the top of villain's range, right? I think that in most cases just has to be a pretty fundamental aspect of how we're building our strategies, because if we don't know where the top of villain's range is, it's extremely difficult to really build out any kind of a reasonable strategy. So it's certainly the case that we have to think about where the top is. The idea of figuring out where the value hands in their range are, I think the way that I would slightly reframe that is just to recognize that there are going to be only a pretty small number of hands in their range that constitute an actual value hand. in any kind of a spot, right? And ultimately, the fact that the ranges are still pretty wide means that there are a lot of hands in LoJack's range and a lot of hands in your range that are not necessarily easily categorized as just value, but also, not exactly particularly weak either. And so I think the other thing that we have to consider here really is we have to start by looking at, in our range, what are the hands that we are going to have that are going to be strong enough to value bet? What's the range of hands that we are looking to get some value from here? And obviously, we've got a whole bunch of different bet sizes available to us in situations like this. But one thing that is, reasonably clear here with this type of a situation is that if we consider all of these sizes, we've got like a super tiny 1 big blind min bet, we've got a 30 big blind block size, we've got 75, we've got 150, and we've got all in. The all in's not really being used because it's a massive all in for 600% of pot. But every bet size is being used at a reasonable frequency here, right? We've got like all kinds of different sizes being used. And what that kind of speaks to is that Villain's range on this river card is so weak that even a hand like an 8 or a pocket pair above an 8 is strong enough that it has a pretty good incentive to at least want to get some chips in the pot here, right? Because the only region of hands that we have on the left that's actually checking at a high frequency and and not really able to value bet for any size is actually a 3 or a low pocket pair or an ace high, right? So that's kind of the first thing, that because we have a variety of sizes available, pretty much everything is good enough that, if it has the ability to get occasionally called by some stuff that's worse, even if it's, betting 1 big blind and getting called by ace high, those hands are actually in pretty decent shape to put money in the pot here because they are, strong enough that they're beating a lot of Villain's range. So you do tend to see this quite a bit. And if we look at all possible runouts here, what we'll probably see is that almost every runout, I would expect at least, almost every river card here is probably going to feature quite a bit of these small bets, simply because here we go, right? We can see it right here. The range that we're going to have is going to be containing a lot of 8x. It's going to be containing a good amount of king x. It's going to be containing some 3x, some pocket pairs, some misdraw type hands and stuff, obviously. But one way or another, there's quite a lot of hands in our range that have the ability to bet small and get a little bit of thin value here, right? So there's always going to be some region of hands that wants to use that kind of block bet size. And it's not always going to be true across every single flop turn and river combination. But as you can see in this particular situation, on every single river card here, there's some region of hands that has the power to use that block size. And there's a good amount of the 30% size being used as well. So
So the
small
block
bets.
size as in the 10% is what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean the super small size is like the 1 big blind size, the min bet size, and then the block size is like the 30%, right? That's kind of how I'm referring to it here. But you could also refer to the 10% as a block size as well. But essentially, I guess what I'm getting at is that there is a pretty good amount of small betting going on. And there's also, a reasonable chunk of hands that have the ability to bet large. And it's kind of a linear progression almost, if we want to look at the way that these bet sizes are constructed. Because if I highlight one at a time here, well, we know the all-in size isn't really being used. But let's say we highlight the B150. Well, the hands that are using that size, they're not really, I guess there's a tiny, tiny frequency with some of these hands. So that's why they're showing up when I highlight it. But the majority of the hands that are using this B150 are going to be, as you can see, like there's some top pair. Quite a lot of kind of king 10 plus is featuring in this sizing. There's also some king 3 and king deuce for 2 pair right there. And there's a bunch of missed draws as well. So it's just a very polar size that's coming from pretty much king 10 or better as the value region there. And then we've got the next size down, which is the B75. And that size, as you can see, is coming from a lot of king 9 through king 4. So the weaker top pairs, but still strong enough to value bet pretty clearly here. King 9, king 7, king 6 over here, doing a lot of that B75. Pocket jacks, if we do have it, is doing a lot of B75, although that's super low frequency. And of course, we got bluffs in there as well. Then we go B30. Well, the B30, again, is happening from a lot of the queen 8, ace 8. You've got pocket 10s, pocket 9s. So the bulk of the value range that's betting this size is a strong 8. And then the B11 is basically a weaker 8 or, a 7, maybe pocket 6s, hands like that, right? So it's actually a pretty linear progression of which size is used with which range of hands. And you can kind of see a little bit of that in the range map at the bottom. You've got this chunk here in the middle. If I drag that over here, and then we drag this over here, this is the portion of the range that is heavily incentivized to check. And as you can see, other than a little bit of 7x right there, just kind of put it here, it's basically just a 3 and then pocket 4s. I don't know why 5-4 is in there because it really doesn't have equity, but that is pretty much this region of hands just having a pure check, right? So there's a certain region of hands that we don't ever really have to think about betting because we have no incentive to do so. So we're going to reset that. And then again, if we focus on the top portion of the range, so I go like this is the value stuff. And you can see that there's a distinction there in terms of this region here, kind of in this upper portion, maybe having the incentive to go with the bigger sizes. So we've got right there. That's the region that's preferring to go with the bigger sizes. And it's very clearly dominated by a lot of king X, right? And if I reset it right there, the only exception to that is the very, very top, which is here. And that's exactly these hands, pocket 8s, 8-7, pocket 7s, 7-3, 7 deuce, etc. Why do you think some of these hands might either check or use the block size here? Why do you think there might be a benefit to that?
We just need some of our top range in those betting categories also.
We do, but why specifically is this region so favorable for this?
I mean, as in our sets and 2 pairs.
Well, remember that this is not all of our 2 pairs, right? We have king 3, we have king 7, king deuce, but we're not doing it with those hands, right? So think about the fact that it's specifically
because we're unblocking kings.
Yes, exactly, right? So in particular, we're not we're not just unblocking a king, but the reason why unblocking a king is really nice here is because number one, if we use the block size, a king is going to raise. A king basically has to raise here, right? So that's nice. It's not just that they're going to just call, it's that they're going to raise with a king when we bet really small. But on top of that, because we actually have an 8 or a 7 in this case, or we have blockers to a lot of these middle pair, bottom pair type hands, what's really nice is we're unblocking a lot of the hands that have an incentive to bluff raise as well, right? We're actually blocking the stuff that calls, and we're unblocking the stuff that either raises for value or raises as a bluff. So we block with these hands to induce because we actually have more power to get raised in this case. That's why this portion of hands wants to use the block size. But other than that,
why are we actually checking those hands?
I'm sorry?
Why are we checking those hands?
At any frequency, you mean? A similar concept. When we check and a king value bets, we check raise, right? It's a similar idea.
We're in the big blind. I forgot.
We're in the big blind. Yeah, exactly.
Low jack. I'm like, I don't
exactly. Yeah, no, we're not. I mean, we're never going to have like 8-3 suited from the low jack, right? So yeah, we're definitely the big blind here. So we're basically using that block size here to kind of induce with the very top of our range, and then we have all the stuff that's just an obvious value bet, like the king X type stuff, and we have this kind of slightly more medium-sized value bet region, which is like everything right here. So strong king X, a king 4 through king 10, basically that kind of area. And then we also, we have this block region, which we kind of identified. We've got the 2 block sizes here, but if I hone in on the range that's actually doing that, you can again see it's very clearly a lot of the 8x, a lot of the middle pair type stuff. Now you don't have to have the B11 and the B30 here. You can just simplify to 1 block size of like 2 big blinds or something like that. But the bottom line is that these hands have a pretty good incentive to block on the river. And then you have the bottom region, which is actually kind of simple in that, as you can see, everything below a certain strength of hand is bluffing at a pretty high rate. And the only stuff that isn't is basically the ace jack and ace queen, because they have a decent chunk of showdown value already. And in fact, some of those hands are blocking because they actually can get called by worse ace highs occasionally. So in the end, everything that is queen high or worse, if we were to if I reset everything here, and then I just highlight everything that's worse than ace high here, so the nothing category, literally every single hand worse than ace high is bluffing 100% of the time here. It's just they're altering the sizes, right? And this, I think, is really important because people are quite inclined to think that, we can't just like take every single bottom of our range hand and bluff here because, how do we represent good hands, or we don't have enough hands that we can rep. But the thing about it is, if we're check raising the right kinds of hands on the flop, we don't have that much air to begin with here. We only have 8% nothing, right? So if we don't have that many nothing hands left by this river, then we do actually have to bluff with them at a very high rate, because otherwise we're going to end up under bluffing, right? And on top of that, of course, we're targeting a range from villain that is relatively capped. Like, they don't have a ton of strong hands here. So we get to value bet quite big with a king. And we also get to bluff, pretty aggressively here as well because of that. And on top of that, we also don't ever have to worry about checking a king, right? Like, we can kind of look at here what our top pair region is doing. There's a tiny bit of checking with king queen, but that's checking to check raise. It's not checking to like protect our range, right? It's checking because king queen is strong enough that it actually has a little bit of ability to get thin value from a worse king or pocket nines or something that bets the river when checked to, right? So we just don't need to protect our checking range by having a king in there. And the stuff that protects our range is the stuff that is kind of, check raising here, is the stuff that's being a bit trappy. And then also the stuff that is check calling by, to just bluff catch. So that's kind of one important thing. But let's now look at what
Real quick,
Sure, go ahead.
our bluffs are the queen jacks to like 10-9s area. I guess, are we just targeting like 8s and worse essentially?
We're not really targeting an 8 because it's extremely difficult for villain to fold an 8 here unless we're using the really big size. Like, any 8 is so close to the top of villain's range that I would be surprised if they're folding an 8 very much here. Maybe to the B150 they will, but let's see. So villain's response here, when we use B150, let's see what they're doing. It's going to take a second. They are, now that an 8 is mixing, right, against the B150. But even like 6s, 5s, 4s, they're still mixing those hands. So again, they just have to mix all their bluff catches. They can never fold a king to B150 versus B75. I would expect that an 8 is probably not folding very much. Okay. Yeah. I mean, ace 8 is almost pure call against B75. Some of the weaker 8s that are blocking the bluffs are starting to fold some, but again, it's a mix. Even 5s and 4s are a mix. And then versus the B30, well, now, we're actually basically going for thin value with B30 with like a 7. So now an 8 definitely can't fold, right? So we're only targeting an 8 with the bigger sizes here. Yeah. And even then, like the 150, like we're targeting their bluff catchers in general. It's not just an 8. We're using that size with a range of a king or better or a bluff. And therefore everything that doesn't beat a king becomes a bluff catcher, right? So whether that's pocket 8s or 6s or 5s or 4s or whatever. But they just don't have a lot of good hands here. They only have 13% top pair. They have 0% or close to 0% two pair or set. So the king X is the only stuff that we're really sort of concerned by in terms of the overall nature of their range, right?
And then how are we mixing that? Those sizes, like how
With
would we
those,
mix them?
with the bluffs, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't think it matters a ton. In the end, I think if you look at the card removal stuff, there's not, there's not a massive kind of a preference here, but you can sort of see that the stuff that has a jack, a 9, a 10, that stuff, because it's actually blocking a lot of uh the king X, like king 10, king 9, king jack, that might check back the turn. That stuff has a little bit more power to go bigger. Um, and then the lower card stuff is kind of mixing a bit more. I think as a general rule of thumb, though, the way I would do this in a practical sense, if you're not going to actually randomize, then what you can just do is say, okay, well, if I have queen high, then the only way this bluff makes any sense is if I'm quite confident my opponent's folding ace high. Whereas if I have 5 high, then even if I just get him to fold 10 high, that's a decent result. So I would lean more towards the smaller to medium sizes with the 9 high, 6 high, 5 high type stuff, just to get queen high to fold. But with the queen high and jack high bluffs that we have, I would go with the bigger sizes to make absolutely sure that we get ace high to fold, right? But I don't think it's going to matter a ton in terms of how you actually distribute your bluffs between the frequencies. I just think it's important to recognize that every time we get to this spot with worse than queen high, it's pretty much a mandatory bluff. Like you should bluff a lot here because villain's range is so capped, and also because your range has a strong incentive to value bet with basically every king. Now,
Just also kind of interesting, just the like in real time, I
yeah,
might have thought of this spot as like queen jack, queen 10, like 10-9. All those hands are like kind of bad to be bluffing with. But like you said earlier, we just have so little trash hands that we just have to bluff with something, and that's all we have left, kind of.
yeah, and it's also just we have so many value bets too, right? Like that, we have so many hands that are betting for value. We have a ton of combinations of a king here. Like if we focus in on top pair specifically, where is it? Did I click that properly? Okay, no, top pair. We have 65 combos of top pair alone. And that's a ton of combos of like straight value here. Like, it's pure value to bet a king here. Like we can bet 75% or bigger here with a king. And having that many combos of value hands here just gives us a lot of liberty to bluff with combos that can't win at showdown, right? And in the end, if we have quite a lot of value combos like this still left in our range, we don't have to be super conservative with the types of bluff combos that we pick. If we only had like 20, 25 value combos here, we would have to be a little bit more specific. But we are check raising a lot of those combos of Broadway stuff on the flop, so that's one part of it. But we also just we have plenty of value here, right? We can just be really comfortable when we have a king in this spot, and therefore that just allows us to have a lot of bluffs as well, right? And now to look at the line where we check, to kind of flip it around and look at it from the low jack's perspective here. I think people kind of get themselves a bit tied in knots in this line because they think, oh, well, I didn't bet the turn. How can I possibly bluff here? But all it really comes down to is you certainly still can bluff because you do have some hands that check the turn and then value bet the river. And if we look at the runouts here after big blind checks, we're probably just going to see that in position or low jack here still has plenty of hands that can bet the river here. It's just going to be that the sizings that they use are not going to be especially big, right? There's a little bit of some pot size bet here. But if we look at like the all in is basically never used, although there's a tiny, tiny bit of it on the 9, which is kind of weird, but 150%, again, not really used very much, not really seeing a ton of that coming in. 100% is used. You can see on a king, it's used a bit because when we check to villain, we're not going to have a king very much, so they can still value bet a bit bigger there. B75, that's used fairly often, particularly on an ace, 4 or 6. And then you've also got B50 being used at a reasonable rate there as well for some slightly thinner value betting. So they have plenty of hands that can bet. They are checking back the river more than half the time facing a check, but that doesn't mean that they can't bet, right? It doesn't mean that they can't have, value bets. And it just comes down to once the big blind does check, the nature of the big blind's range is such that there is a pretty specific portion of in positions range that is basically pure value bet here, right? If you look at everything in this category, pretty much, other than the bit of queen eight suited, pretty much everything that beats an eight is just a pure value bet here, right? Everything that has a king, everything that beats an eight, pocket queens, small exception, pocket tens, nines, decent eight, like all that stuff is pure value bet. And then to look at the next segment down, there's a certain chunk of mixing that comes in here. And then there's also, kind of a boundary where everything below that becomes, pretty trivial check back. So we got some mixing with jacks there. We got tens and nines kind of pure. So it looks like jacks, probably there's some card removal stuff going on. Again, an eight is kind of mixing. Even ace seven is like kind of doing some 50% value betting there. But for the most part, once we get below that, we're going to come right around to this sort of area, and you're going to see pretty much that pure check region right here, right? Ace, queen, ace, jack, sixes, fives, fours, ace three, ace deuce, right? In position has no reason to ever bet these hands. They have too much showdown value. They have no reason to bluff. Like they can't really get better to fold. It's just very straightforward check back, right? So pretty simple spot for them there. And then if we look at the types of hands that are bluffing, they are going to be in some tricky spots because they do have to kind of mix a lot more when it comes to their bluffs to avoid over bluffing, because they have a lot more bluff candidates available here than we do. And you can see that there's a little bit more of a desire to be kind of focused around certain cards from in position here. So they have a bit more, they want to have like a queen 10, queen 9, jack 9, like blockers to some of our best eights. So they block when they have queen 9 or whatever, they block queen 8, which is one of our best 8x hands that's a bit more inclined to check. Ace 6 type hand, they can now fold out better ace highs here. And the six, I guess, blocks like king 6 and 8-6, probably two of the better hands that can check river here. So they have to be a bit more cautious, but it's not like the fact that we rarely have a king when we check the river here just allows them to really go nuts, because they rarely have a king either, right? And if we look at what our response would be here versus B75, for example, on this river, from the perspective of the big blind, we're going to have to do a decent chunk of bluff catching, but there's not going to be that many hands that have a super challenging decision here. Versus B75, we're pretty much going to have a region of hands that's pure raise if we do get here with those hands. So let's say everything here. If we get here with, honestly, it looks like king 10 is kind of just a call, but yeah, if we get here with any two pair plus, or basically king queen plus, it's just a pure raise, a pure shove for value. And then next category down is going to be everything that is pretty much pure call. So we've got right there, and then we've got right here. So the pure call stuff, as you can see, is pretty much an 8 or a 7, right? All this stuff, if we get here with an 8 or a 7, we just don't fold to B75 because it's just too strong in our range. It's too high up in our range. We are too vulnerable to bluffs if we do start folding hands this strong. But obviously, a lot of these hands were using the blocker bet size in the first place anyway, so they're not doing a ton of check calling. They're mostly blocker betting, but if they don't, then they prefer to just check call. And then the stuff that's actually mixing is going to be towards the bottom end right here. And you can see that that is pretty much anything below a 7. So 6s and below, 3x, that's the sort of stuff that's actually indifferent here. So it's not really that big of a deal, as we said, that we're never realistically checking a king very much on the river here, because the only negative consequence that really comes from that is that the low jack gets to put us in a tough spot when we have something like pocket 4s or a 3, and that's just not that big of a deal, right? That's just not like something that villain can really take a ton of advantage of, because we have enough 8x and 7x that it's not like they just get to, value bet relentlessly there in that spot anyway. So there are a lot of hands that are just kind of a mixed bluff catcher here. Even a deuce is actually a mixed bluff catcher on the river here because, it beats all bluffs. But as you can kind of imagine, we don't really have to, be super concerned about this spot in terms of, you know, being careful that we don't get run over with bluffs or anything, because we have, a lot of our EV is coming from the portion of our range that is betting anyway. We're betting this particular river at a good frequency when check two. We're only checking sorry, not when check two, but when it's checked back on the turn. We're only checking a third of the time on this river anyway. And the fact that when we do check this river, we mostly have a 3 or ace high or a low pocket pair. It just isn't actually that big of a deal as long as we are making good decisions as to whether we should bluff catch with those hands or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
That's the response to the all in.
Yeah, sure. I mean, villain's probably just going to be bluff catching with a lot of their king X. I imagine those king X are going to mix, and then any low frequency trappy stuff is going to be the stuff that calls off. Let's see. Yeah, so their mixes are like we got right here. We've got mixes that are king queen, set of kings. If they bet 9-7, there's some weird that's just a blocker thing, I think, probably, but you can see if they have king queen here, if they have two pair, a set, something like that, if they happen to have those, obviously you're just calling off. But because it's a big shove, it's a river shove for a more than 2x pot, they can fold 78% of their range here, you can see, and they're not super concerned about anything that might happen there either. It's organized the EVs here in a different way because it's got the mixed stuff at the other end. The mixed stuff is going to show up occasionally here as actually looking like it's negative EV, even though it's not. But yeah, you can see any king here is kind of mixing. There's some slight blocker effects going on where it's better to have king 10 than have king 6, but it's not going to matter a ton either way. They're just basically they're in an indifferent spot. They're in a bluff catching spot when they actually do have just a king. And then the stuff that is not indifferent is pretty much exactly king queen, because they sometimes chop against us having king queen. Well, actually, I don't really know why ace king is not better there, but that's got to be a card removal thing. But it's basically just the small frequency of stuff that they actually did trap with on the turn. That's the stuff that can call the all in every time, and then everything else is just a bluff catcher against the all in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was kind of looking to see what ace 3 was getting to fold. Ace 3 was.
Oh yeah, I mean ace 3 is getting
so a lot
yeah, it's getting jacks, tens, that sort of stuff.
A lot of stuff fold.
Mm-hmm.
Just cool.
Yeah, and we're blocking ace king as well, which is kind of nice, right?
Right.
And we also know that villain is not going to bluff the river with that much ace high. So when we have a hand like ace 3, we are we're unblocking a lot of the snap fold hands that villain just has to fold because they're bluffs anyway, which is also kind of nice. So that's the kind of way these pan out when we've got a pretty straightforward spot here where the flop betting range is not it's a diverse, it's a wide flop betting range, right? But what I want to now look at is I want to pick out a spot where in this specific scenario, I want to find a spot where the B75 is used a lot. I want to look at a larger flop bet size. So let's go, maybe not one where it's used a lot, maybe one where it's used half the time. This is a nice one, 10-8-7. Okay. So in this spot, the B75 is used. Actually, you know what? Let's make it a two-tone board, because I want to make sure that we cover something that involves some flush draws. Okay, what have we got? B75 used about, 10-7-6 is fine. Okay, so two-tone, 10-7-6, low jack uses B75, and again, it's going to go check call, turn's going to go check check. So in this case, depending on what the turn is, I'm going to make the turn kind of a brick here again. I'm going to make it just a deuce of spades. The dynamic as far as what the turn check back range looks like is going to be a little bit different. This is kind of interesting because big blind is supposed to do a surprising amount of, oh wait, I didn't mean to follow the check check line. Oops. That's what I wanted. B75, call. And okay, so yeah, there's not a lot of donking going on. No donking at all. And now again, we're going to follow the check check. Now the thing we have to be aware of here is that the checking range for the turn here for in position is still, again, it's going to be fairly capped. They're never checking back an overpair here. They are only checking back a tiny amount of top set. And other than that, some weakish top pair is kind of the top of their range. But they also have plenty of draws. They have draws that are checking back the turn. So there are going to be some river cards where the draws get there, and therefore they're not capped anymore. So we're going to go check, check. I'm going to put a random river out there. And I want to specifically, again, look at the runouts and see how the overall framework of big blind sizings is going to look. So we have pretty similar types of sizing structures or pretty similar types of betting options. This time we have the 10% size, but it's 1.5 big blinds, obviously, because the pot is slightly bigger. We're just loading up the runouts. Okay. So now we have a little bit of, kind of a different differentiation or different kind of ranking of how we look at the river cards, right? There's a few things that are happening that are a bit different. First of all, let's actually go suit and then rank. Right there. There we go. So what do you notice looking at the suits here and the way that the sizings are structured? Is there anything that kind of jumps out at you from this?
I mean, it looks like just pairing the flop is pretty nice for us.
Uh-huh.
It's a bigger size.
Yep. When the flop is when the river is a 10, 7, or 6, like now we have lots of trips and we have lots of one pair hands. That's for sure true. Yeah. What else in terms of the differences between one suit and another? Is there one suit that's like better or worse for us than the others?
Diamonds are definitely worse.
Yeah, diamonds are actually a little bit worse, right? And that's because obviously both players' draws complete on the diamonds. And when that happens and we're out of position, life gets a little trickier. If we look at sorting by rank and then by suit, you can kind of see that a little bit, because if you compare like all the ace cards, the diamond is clearly slightly worse, right? So that's also quite important. But if we look at sorting by something like aggression, right, this is going to give us a sense of which river cards we're putting in the most betting volume, basically, like on which cards are we putting in the most chips. And as you can see, the ones where we're putting in a lot are, like you said, the ones that pair the board, but also the ace of diamonds specifically, which is quite interesting. And I think that's going to be because we have more nut flushes now when the river is specifically the ace of diamonds. If we go with sorting by check, then the ones that we're checking the most are the diamonds that also complete some straight draws, which is quite interesting. I would imagine that might be because we potentially have a bit more incentive to do some check raising on those cards. And then the ones that we're checking the least, well, if you get down to like a deuce, if you get down to a 7, a 6, a 10, we're almost never checking these cards, right? We have so many good hands in our range for getting to this river, or so many hands that have some kind of interaction with this board, that because villain can never have an overpair once they check back the turn, on any of these cards, we're in really, really good shape on the river here. So it's going to be interesting to check out some of the differences in the strategies here. Let's look at the 8 of diamonds first, which is, the river card that in fact forces us to actually do more checking than what we might expect. And we'll see how some of those same dynamics that we observed from before are playing out here. Now, what do you immediately notice about this river card here, this 8 of diamonds?
I mean, we're literally almost just always checking.
Well, we're checking 2/3 of our range. So I wouldn't say that's almost always, but there is a pretty distinct trend in what bet sizes we're using, right? What do you notice there?
Just that 10% size, really.
Yeah, we're using 10%, and we're occasionally jamming, right? There's like a small frequency of some jams in there for 3.5x pot, which is kind of crazy. And we don't have any of that B75. We don't have the B150. We don't even have the B30 in there at any significant kind of frequency. Why do you think that might be happening here? Why do you think those hands, might, well, those sizings might not really be used?
Man, I'm guessing it's just not going to do much of a difference with those sizes, but not too
What do
sure
you,
though.
Okay. Think about the threshold of hands that we are uh, able to value bet on this river, right? Based on the fact that it went check, big bet, call on the flop, check, check on a deuce of spades turn, and then eight of diamonds river. What hands in our range are strong enough to value bet on this river?
Flushes and
Mhm.
probably two pair plus, I guess.
Okay. If we are going to value, let's say we're going to have two pair here, right? Let's say we're going to have, let's say we have 10-8. It's a two pair that we might have, top two pair here. If we are going to value bet 10-8, what portion of low jack's range are we targeting with that hand? Like, what are we trying to get value from?
Yeah, really just those single pair hands. There's not much of us that are gonna want to call.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, like what single pair hands would we want them to have?
I mean, ace 10, top pair, top kicker.
Yeah, but we would want them to have an overpair, but they can't have them. That's the problem,
Right.
right? Like when they check back the turn, they never have an overpair. So when we have 10-8 and we block top pair, we block second pair, it's really kind of tricky for us to bet any kind of a chunky size with two pair and expect to actually get called by worse, because they mostly have a range of hands that is either stuff that's going to have a pretty trivial fold versus that size, or straights and flushes, right? And that kind of means that something like B75 here with two pair wouldn't really make a lot of sense. And then if you look at something like a flush, well, if we had a flush, it's true that we are targeting, a worse flush, a straight, stuff like that. But again, if we have a flush, then outside of specifically having a straight, it's not that easy for them to have very many hands that will pay off kind of a chunky size like the B75 or even the B150 here, because of just how strong our range is in terms of flushes and straights. Like you can see, we have a straight 21% of the time and a flush 14% of the time. So more than a third of our range is straights and flushes. And then another 17% is sets and two pairs. So about half of our range at this point is two pair plus, which means it's really tough for villain to pay off any kind of big bet uh, with a one pair hand, right? They just don't really do that very much. And so that kind of creates this drag effect where a lot of our strong hands here actually have a pretty hard time getting value for a big size. And they have a bit more incentive to try to go with a size that's actually inducing some raises, kind of like we saw in the previous situation, right? So this is what's happening with that 10% size. What we're doing is we're betting a size where we're betting small enough that villain has to raise with a 9. Like anytime villain has a flush or a 9 here, they have to raise against that B10 size. And so instead of trying to bet big with a flush and get called by a straight, what we're doing is we're building a strategy where we have this really small size that contains a bunch of different hands. And now, because that size contains something like two pair fairly often, when villain has a 9, they always raise. And that means we get a ton of value from the times we actually have a flush, right? So we're no longer up against a range that has a lot of good bluff catches in it. In fact, we're up against a range that has a lot of very, very weak hands in it, and then some very, very strong hands. So we're kind of blocking for that reason here. We're doing a lot of blocking to get a tiny bit of value from the weaker portion, and then induce some bluff raises as well. And then also induce some value raises from the strong stuff. So if I look at what villain's response is against B10 here, we'll see this in action. And I expect, yeah, as you can see, interestingly, a straight can't even always raise. That's surprising. I'm definitely surprised by that. Um, a straight does raise at a decent frequency. Jack 9. Oh, wow. Okay. So it's Jack 9 specifically does raise like the higher straight, but they don't even, they raise pocket nines with a diamond, ace 9 with a diamond, but they're not even supposed to raise king 9 here or queen 9. That's really interesting against that block size. So we just have even more of an advantage in this spot than I would have thought. Their raising range here is pretty much they're just like jamming flushes and bluffs. And outside of that, you can see they have a lot of like stuff that is just forced to call this B10 size. So like they have right here through to pretty much right around here. This is the pure call region. So a 10, is calling the B10 size. An 8 is forced to call. Obviously, a straight is in there, 2 pair sets. A lot of this stuff is kind of forced to call this B10 size. So they have a lot of hands there that can't really fold. But they also, as you can see, they have 28% ace high and 20% king high. So if we bet a big size, those hands just have a trivially obvious fold, right? And there's tons of other stuff here, like they have 7% second pair, 9% nothing, 6% low pair, 3% third pair. Villain's range is just really, really weak now, and our range is very, very strong. So using a lot of those big bet sizes with our value hands doesn't actually get us paid a lot. And instead, we prefer to use a lot of these block sizes to kind of induce and try to put villain in a spot where they're raising with a lot of hands that we then we get max value from, because they do a lot of jamming with some of these flushes and some bluffs as well. So that's an interesting one, kind of a unique one in the sense that we just have tons and tons of really strong hands in this spot, and that kind of leads us to do a certain amount of blocking here. But let's look at in this same formation.
Real quick.
Sure.
Am I assuming then that ace 5, ace 4 suited is jamming just the non-flush?
Let's take a look. That is no, the non-flush are just pure folding.
No, from the big blind, the
oh right, okay.
Really the jams that we have.
Sorry, yeah. So the jams here, you can see ace 4 suited is the diamonds, ace 5 suited is the diamonds, ace queen suited it's the diamonds, and our bluffs are like ace 6 with the ace of diamonds.
Interesting.
Ace jack, ace of diamonds. So the jamming range is exclusively a few specific combos of nut flushes, and then a few specific combos of the ace of diamonds. So it's just a really, really polar range.
So then you're really just targeting their flushes then at that point?
Yeah, basically you're targeting the flushes that you're not blocking, basically. Like you're targeting like to get the absolute max from some of the flushes. And I would suspect if we follow that all in pathway here, there might even be some non-flush hands that are forced to bluff catch. There might be some like pocket nines with the 9 of diamonds stuff that's forced to bluff catch. Yeah, they don't always call with a flush, actually. King 9 of diamonds actually mixes folds, which is kind of surprising. But they are forced to sometimes bluff catch a straight. So that's kind of interesting. Pocket nines right there with a diamond. Even some other stuff that has a diamond blocker, like even pocket 10s without a diamond. So it looked like they're kind of forced to call this all-in shove at least some tiny frequency with some of these other hands, which is quite interesting. But for the most part, that all-in is just nut flushes and a few flush blocker bluffs, basically. So really, really polar range. And this does exist sometimes when you see these massive shoves on rivers for 3.5x pot. Just the nut flush or the nut flush blocker is a reasonably common sort of a range to see that. Let's now put up a different river here. What I want to put in is let's put a queen of spades river up there, because that's kind of a brick. And after this turn goes check, check, and then we see the queen of spades river. Obviously, that's doing a completely different thing to the ranges that are in play. But the principles are still somewhat similar in that villain still has a pretty weak range. If we look at the side-by-side representation here, I got to figure out how to, let's say villain. Okay, let's say we check the river just to see what villain's range actually looks like. When we actually arrive at the river here, villain has a set 1% of the time, 2-pair 2%. They do have top pair 25% of the time, but obviously having a queen here as a top pair is not exactly the nuts. They have 26% ace high, 16% king high. So 40% of their range is ace high or worse, plus another 7% of jack high and 5 high. So basically half their range is ace high or worse here. And that, again, is contributing to their overall range just being very weak in this situation after they bet big on the flop and then it goes check, check. So it's a different kind of a situation because of the fact that when they bet big on the flop and then check back, their range includes just a lot of their more polar flop bluffs that were kind of giving up on the turn. And so that's why they have so much ace high and king high now. And if we go back to our strategy here and we look at, let's say, what happens if we use the B10, we can just hover there. Against B10, when we use B10, villain is basically forced to raise most of their top pair plus, even some second pair for value here, which is kind of one of the benefits of that B10. If we use B30, villain now is still forced to raise most top pair, but they're not raising second pair anymore. If we use B75, well, now, their top pair does a little bit of raising, but they mostly just have some pretty comfortable calls. B150, kind of a similar thing. And then if we shove, now their top pair is pretty indifferent. So there is a certain amount of shoving going on. It's really just a range of straights, a couple of sets and two pairs, like some specific combos, and then bluffs from us here. So there's just a few very specific hands there. But for the most part, it's another situation where we're using these small sizes. And if I go back to the strategy dashboard here, we're doing a lot of this block betting because we have a range that after we check call the flop against a big bet, this range is pretty heavy on one pair, right? We have low pair 17%, third pair 23%, second pair 20%. So the range setup here is that the most common hand that we have is second pair or third pair, or basically just one weak pair. And the most common hand that villain has is ace high or king high. And those two regions of hands being so prevalent generates a situation where our strategy is to do a lot of small betting, and villain is then forced to at least consider bluff catching with a lot of that weaker stuff that they still have. As you can see, if we use the B10, ace high has to call like most of the time here. They only get to fold ace high 8% of the time, right? So we're forcing them to give us a little bit extra value there. If we use B30, ace high is still probably going to have to call a lot. Yeah, I mean, they still call more than half the time with ace high here if we use B30. So we're really just taking that second pair and third pair stuff that we have and getting a little bit of extra thin value from those ace highs and king highs that, in fact, were bluffs on the earlier streets that now are basically just, not really going to have a ton of showdown value. Even king high has to call like quite a bit here if we use B30 on the river. So that's kind of the usefulness of those small sizes here. It's that when we see a scenario like this where the flop features a big bet, after we check call against that big bet, we're mostly going to have one pair or a draw. We're not going to have a lot of no pair anymore. When the flop is a small bet, we're going to have a lot more no pair hands that call that bet. So that increase in no pair hands in our range, and the fact that we're, raising off a lot more of the two pair plus that would just raise the flop against a small bet, that's going to create a very different river spot to where we are the player that called a big bet on the flop. Because when we call a big bet, we have a lot of one pair. We don't have as much in the way of, particularly obvious bluff candidates. And because we just have a lot of one pair and we don't have a ton of bluffs, we use a lot of those small sizes to just get a little bit of thin value from that ace high region, and sometimes to induce a lot of raises from other portions of the range. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. And then for this particular spot, if we just look at it from the perspective of the in-position player versus the check, we're probably going to see some pretty similar dynamics to what we saw before. If we load up all the runouts, we'll most likely see a consistent trend there where, we have that same sizing framework or proximate sizing framework being used. There is some bigger betting that occurs now because once we actually check on certain cards, our range becomes a bit more capped. But there's also a lot of river cards here that are just really bad for in position. You can see if the river's a 10, the river's a 9, 8, 7, and we check to them, they just check back a ton because they have so few good hands now, right? They have a really low frequency of good hands on some of those rivers. And the only rivers that are kind of good for them are going to be some of the ace, king, queen, jack kind of cards, where a lot of their Broadway hands that were just bluffing the flop now actually improve to a top pair hand. On a lot of these other cards, they just don't really improve much at all. So they're, again, just not going to have a ton of reason or a ton of incentive to bet rivers here. But if we looked at, let's say, what they do on, let's say the 8 of diamonds, because we just looked at that one to begin with here. If we do check this 8 of diamonds, which we're not doing a lot, check. They do a bit of jamming with those flushes. They're able to bet a straight, but they're not even able to bet a straight every time when we check to them here. That's crazy. I thought they would always bet a straight when we check to them, but looks like they're not. And they're certainly not able to bet top pair, 2 pair, all that sort of stuff. So that's just generally a much worse river card than we would think here. Oops. Let's go. Let's get rid of that one. Oh, damn it. Didn't mean to do that. 8. Yeah, there we go. Let's put up a deuce of clubs. So just another deuce right there. On this particular river, wow, we really don't check very much at all here. Because this is such a brick, it doesn't influence villain's range at all. This is a little bit more like the previous spot, where, as you can see, we have a lot of top pair now that is going to have the incentive to use that B75 or B150 kind of a size. So we do see some of that stuff starting to come back in. But let's say we do check here. If that does happen, villain now gets to do some pretty straightforward value betting for like pot with a 10, and even 9s and 8s get to start value betting now. So this is a bit more in line with what we might expect here if we do happen to check the river. But obviously, there's tons of hands here that we can value bet with, and it really does extend as wide as second pair or third pair, basically almost always being a value bet for us. And again, villain just has so much ace high that we can bet these hands quite liberally. If we look at B30, I would expect that villain calls most of their ace high against B30. They call about half of their ace high against B30. They ace high with overcards, they mostly call. Ace high with a bad card, or low kicker, they fold, presumably because they block some of our bluffs. But they're forced to continue a lot here. All their underpairs, all their third pairs, second pair, they have to call those hands. And against B10, now I would expect the ace high mostly calls. Yeah, it still actually folds sometimes, but higher frequency of calls here. So we're able to basically take a 7 or a 6 here and treat a 7 or a 6 like a hand that wants to get value, except the amount of value that it wants to get is not really that significant, right? We're looking to take a 7 or a 6 and get value from a hand slightly worse than that, right? And when we have a 10, we can bet a bit bigger because, again, we're looking to get value from a hand slightly worse than that, which is like a 7, right? And it's a linear scale in that regard. Like if we have, full houses here, obviously we're doing some inducing, like we said before. Straights, same sort of a thing. But top pair in particular, when we have top pair, villain has a lot of 7x and 6x in their range that we can just get max value from. So that region of top pair has a pretty strong incentive to use that chunky size, B75, B150 type size, and it works out pretty well for us there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So there's hopefully a lot of dynamics here that are starting to kind of fit into place a bit more. I think these lines with less aggression, these sort of, I would call them, or in Poker Detox, we used to call them discontinued aggression lines. So lines where it's not just a, big bet flop, big bet turn, shove river. Like those types of lines, they're very important. And in particular, what they kind of show you is that in a lot of cases, the game actually works in a bit of a simpler way than you might think, in the sense that if we have a hand that's pretty strong, we pick a bet size on the river that can get called by a hand that's slightly worse, and then we put some bluffs in there as well. And the stronger our hand gets, the bigger we have the capacity to value bet, and the more bluffs we have to try to find to go along with that. But even if our hand is only mildly strong, when we're out of position, the blocker size functions really well because we prevent our opponent from making thin value bets. We prevent them from making thin value raises. And in quite a lot of situations, we just sort of say, okay, we have one value bet size for top pair. We have one value bet size for second pair. We have one value bet size for third pair. Because in the end, a blocker bet is just a value bet, except it's a value bet that is very thin and very small in most cases, right? The purpose of a blocker bet is still to get called by worse. It's just it has the added side effect that it gives your opponent a very different price on raising, and it changes some of the pot odds aspects of the situation to where a lot of their hands will now be indifferent between not just calling or folding, but calling, raising, and folding, right? You can make them kind of doubly indifferent. And if you look at, let's say, the B30 here, there's probably some hands that are in that category. Yeah, this is a good one. So ace queen here, right? Not every combo is in that exact same boat here, but something like ace queen offsuit, ace of diamonds, queen of clubs is actually mixing all three options. It folds like occasionally, it calls mostly, and then it sometimes raises, right? And you can put people in those spots where hands have all three options available to them, and it's just a super difficult decision between all three quite easily with a lot of these blocker sizes. And that's why they come up so often. It's because when your opponent has a lot of medium strength hands and you use a lot of small sizes, quite often they end up in situations where they don't know whether they're supposed to bluff catch, fold, or bluff raise, or even value raise in some cases, right? And that's one of the real benefits of a lot of these small out of position river sizes. So this is a river dynamic or a river situation that it's just as important to understand this as it is to understand the more polar spots. And the polar spots sometimes play themselves because you get there with a bluff candidate and you just kind of have to bluff. But these spots, they're pretty complex, but they're very valuable situations to understand because of the fact that they actually do come up really often. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that's a good spot to wrap it. Sounds good.
Cool.
Cool. All right, man. Talk to you
Bye.
soon. See ya. Bye.
Bye.